It's important to look at the concept of conscious and unconscious movement in a number of ways. And the way that we're going to unpack this is to look at what's called the threat arousal cycle. So if you look on the chart of the threat arousal cycle, you'll notice that social engagement, safety, is the first part of that cycle. And when we're in social engagement, our stress levels are low. Now, as soon as we have a detection of a threat, things change. All of a sudden, unconscious movement comes into the equation. So if you notice, when there's a detection of threat, the nervous system goes into an arousal response. That is, it increases the stress load so that we mobilize our system to escape, fight, or whatever we need to do to survive. So once we detect that, and this is on an unconscious level, we go into what's called the orienting response. So if we detect a threat, we'll naturally start to turn our head both ways. We'll start to look around the room or around our surroundings wherever we are outside. And then, if we detect that there actually is a threat there, we'll go into a stilling response. It means we'll get very still and we'll essentially assess the situation. Again, this is an unconscious process. This is happening below the level of awareness. We might notice a threat in a conscious way, but our nervous system notices much more of that through what's called neuroception, an unconscious scanning of the environment for threat cues. So if our nervous system has assessed there is indeed a threat, well, then we move on to the flight response. You see, humans are not designed to go right into a fight response. Unless you're trained in the military or martial arts, chances are your first response is to try and get away from a threat. Now, if you get trapped, there's a different experience, and you may go into a temporary fight response. That's the next step in the cycle. Now, if we can't flee, if we can't fight, what we end up doing is going into that immobilization response. Now, meanwhile, our movement has unconsciously been shifting. We've been building tension in the muscles in order to run away. Our eyes dilate, our blood pressure goes up, our heart rate goes up. All the blood flow goes into the limbs and the muscles of the arms and legs so that we can run or fight. But when we shift into that immobilization response, when we can't escape threat, what we end up experiencing is a lack of blood flow. All of a sudden, we completely shut down. We go into what's called the freeze response, and perhaps even a collapse response. This is where we can faint. In everyday situations, this is where we might space out or lose our train of thought. So there's a huge spectrum of what can happen depending on the level of threat that's going on and how threatening it actually is. But here's where it gets interesting. Unconscious movement is also instrumental in reintegrating back into balance once the threat is gone. So what happens when we end up coming out of that threatening situation where we no longer detect threat? Our body will naturally start to go into an unconscious movement pattern called neurogenic tremors. Neurogenic tremors start in the psoas muscle, the iliopsoas muscle that connects to the femur bone, the thigh bone, and goes through the pelvis into the lower back. It tilts the hips forward and back, so it's part of the shopping cart push that we talked about. It also allows us to balance when we're standing on one leg. It also helps us to twist. It does so many things physically to support our movements, but in this case, it actually goes into a fetal position in the fight, flight, and then freeze response, where we're immobilized. We go into fetal position. That psoas muscle pulls us into our center, contracts. As we come out of it, we go into those neurogenic tremors in the psoas muscle that was previously contracted in that intense threat response, now starts to shake and tremble. Now, we've been conditioned in our culture to stop that shaking response. If we get held up at gunpoint and after we get away and they've already taken our wallets or whatever happened, we're going to start to shake. Typically, what we'll tell ourselves in this culture, our vulnerability-phobic culture, we end up in a space where we go, get it together, and we stop the shaking. Unfortunately, that leaves that tension energy, that adrenaline, the cortisol trapped in the muscles. It keeps it there. The tension levels stay, and our unconscious level of tension in the body rises. This is called tonus. Tonus is the unconscious level of muscular tension we hold. And every time we suppress an emotion, every time we suppress a sense of vulnerability, every time we do not accept what's going on in our experience, we actually create more tonus, a higher percentage of unconscious muscular tension. Over a lifetime, that goes from the experience of being playful and resilient to hunched over and perhaps holding onto a walker. That's a lifetime of repression, of not being with what's going on in your body and allowing it to heal as it naturally would. So when we get into that space where we have an opportunity to feel the intensity of a fear response that happened, whether we're in a fight with our partner or we're being held up at gunpoint, we get to a place where we can either feel it or not feel it. And there's where we have a conscious choice. It's the opportunity for a conscious choice. Now that you know, there's something there that you can change. You can actually go, wait a second, I'm feeling vulnerable. What if I just stayed with this experience? What if I allowed myself to feel it? What if I allowed myself to do what my body will naturally do? The wisdom of the body kicks in and we start to shake.